No world leader has done more to raise an environmental problem up the political agenda than Mr. Tony Blair. He focused world attention on one of the greatest challenges facing mankind by making climate change a priority. During his presidency of the G8 and EU Council of Ministers in 2005, he focused in large part on moving the international debate forward. He established the Gleneagles Dialogue, commissioned the Stern Review, and promoted legislation to set effective emissions cut in the United Kingdom. The international community now recognizes the threat posed by climate change is real. The question is what to do about it. That is the focus of Mr. Blair's climate change initiative. It is a great honor now to invite the Right Honourable Tony Blair to the stage.
Thank you, Nandan. Can I first of all begin by thanking the Nandanjit Khemka Foundation for not just putting on the event, but for all the magnificent work that the foundation is doing, groundbreaking work actually, in the field of philanthropy and business and how it relates to climate change. We're truly grateful to you and to HSBC for the leadership that you are showing. I'd like also to thank Standard Chartered, who have supported so well the Breaking the Deadlock initiative. And to many of you here from the business world or the world of politics. That's all right. That's a ringtone I hadn't heard before, actually. So I've heard worse. It's just one of the surprising things when you get to know these world leaders, and you kind of think they're very sort of straight-laced people, and then their mobile phone goes off, and it's sort of heavy rock comes out and things. You say, "Oh, there's a secret life there." Anyway, enough of the secret lives of politicians. For me, this issue to do with climate change, I mean, I'm just a politician, right? I'm not a science person, I'm not a business person, I'm not an expert. But the reason I became concerned about this was not because I used to get up every morning and worry about the environment when I first came to office. I mean, if I'm really honest, I was concentrated on the domestic agenda and international events and so on. But the chief scientists who advised the government and many of the leading scientists in my country, and then increasingly from around the world, would come through and see me, and they would say, "We've got to tell you, these are the facts as we see them." And Dr. Bashari and the magnificent work actually, my goodness, I promise you, I did not know you were coming in at this moment. That is brilliant, that is on cue. I was just about to pay an enormous compliment to your work, Dr. Bashari, with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But when people of that eminence come and say to you, this is what we think. We think that there is something very damaging that has occurred as a result of the way industrial growth has happened, that the problem is getting worse, that if the problem is not corrected, it is going to cause severe, possibly catastrophic damage to our planet. Well, I think unless you're an unreasonable type of person, I hope I'm not completely unreasonable, you have to take notice. So that's how I came into this. I mean, I came into this not as part of a pressure group or because I'm myself technologically or scientifically proficient, but because the warnings that people were giving to me were of such a stark nature that I couldn't ignore them. And what is more, as I used to say to people, it's a debate I had in the US a lot of the time, I'd say, because they'd say, well, the science isn't certain. And I'd say, look, nothing is certain, but even on the most elementary precautionary principle, were the science to be correct, and it's at least possible that it's correct, the consequences of it being correct and us not acting now would be to allow this catastrophe to occur. And that's something I don't want on my watch, thank you. So, as a result of that, when I then became the president of the G8 countries in 2005 at Gleneagles, I decided to put this centre stage. And if I'm frank about it, at the time, this didn't go down tremendously well with everybody because they thought, why are we, I said, actually we should be tackling poverty, global poverty and climate change. And I thought it useful that the G8 did something useful. And so I thought, well, let's put that center stage. And then I thought how ridiculous it is to suppose we can deal with this major issue without India and China and the other major economies now and to come being part of this discussion. So we formed the G8 plus 5, which is kind of slightly, if I'm honest, self-selecting in a way. I mean, India and China, very obvious, Brazil and Mexico and South Africa, in a way we had to select, but we did, and we brought together the G8 plus 5. And for the first time then, we started up a dialogue that had America and Japan and Canada and the European countries on the one hand, and the plus 5, including India and China, on the other. Now, there's good news and bad news about the present situation that we find ourselves in. The good news is that there is definitely a burgeoning global concern and the first evidence of global action on this issue. I was in the United States just recently. I would say the atmosphere there on this issue of climate change is completely different from what it was a few years ago. Business is moving. All three of those who may be the President of the United States have got forward positions on the climate change issue. I believe even this administration, which previously had not been in favor of moving on this issue, is now moving on this issue very strongly. And there are states within the United States and cities within the United States taking action. Europe, we agreed this just before I left office, has agreed very ambitious targets now. For 2020, a 20% reduction in emissions in Europe, a 30% reduction if there's a global deal. That's a big commitment from Europe. In Japan, where I was just recently, there's no doubt the debate is moving there. For the first time, Japanese industry is beginning to think and talk about, well, maybe we do need a global target for emissions and so on. So, around the world, this issue is changing. Here in India, the Prime Minister has set up the Climate Change Council, and he's leading it. There is an action plan being produced by India, which I think will be produced before the G8 summit. And I found in my discussion with business leaders today that there's no doubt, again, people are really thinking about this and moving on it. So that's the good news. The bad news is that unfortunately, as we think and deliberate and reflect and discuss and talk, the situation is getting worse. I mean, if we do not change course, then I think I'm right in saying that the IPCC panel said that we would actually grow the emissions by double or more if we don't change course by the middle of the century. If we do not get to a situation where fairly soon we start to peak out, then we may do damage that is irreparable. And whatever measures individual countries are doing at the moment, and although in theory it is possible for unilateral measures to be taken by each country, and in theory it is possible that if you add them all up together, it will solve the problem, I think we know realistically, practically, that is not what is going to happen. So unless there is a global coming together, we cannot deal with this problem adequately. And yet, we know, and we're being warned, that if we don't deal with it, then the potential consequences are catastrophic. And incidentally, India is a good place to debate this issue, since it is here in India that many of these consequences will be felt, and felt most acutely. And the issue of climate change is undoubtedly strongly linked in to issues to do with things like food security, with issues to do with water, with issues to do with energy security, with a whole range of other questions that are also brought into the climate debate. Now, here is what I see as the essential issue and why I wanted to take a role in this. And a role not as a scientific expert or as somebody who's in business and industry, but because this is how I see the political dilemma on this issue.